Hello and welcome to this expert seminar, which is being put on for those involved with the Towns Fund. And it's a joint event being hosted by 3 What Works centres. And if you don't know what a What Works centre, the thing we all have in common is that we are about bringing about changes in both policy and practice informed by evidence, particularly evidence of what works. We are 3 organisations and we'll each introduce ourselves. I'm Anna Dixon, I'm the Chief Executive of the Centre for Ageing Better, and the other 2 What Works centres that have been involved in this event are What Works Wellbeing and the What Works Centre for Local Economic Growth. So we're delighted to be hosting this today, and we really hope that the evidence that we're able to share with you will be really useful to informing your local plans and the business cases that you will be developing. We see the Towns Fund as a really great opportunity for towns across England to support changes that are going to deliver both economic and social benefits. And obviously, in particular, in the light of COVID-19, it's even more important how our towns respond is going to be vital to recovery and how the country, in a sense, gets back on its feet post-COVID. As part of your plans, it's really important that you do provide evidence about both the need and how that need is going to be met through your projects. And we hope that what we'll share with you today will give you a taste of how we could work with you in the future. We're going to be recording the event and sharing it afterwards through the Towns Fund website and through YouTube. So you'll be able to share it with colleagues who are not able to join us live. If you are with us live, please do feel free to post any comments or reactions in the chat. But if you'd like to ask a question, we'd ask that you put that in the Q&A function at the bottom of the screen. And I will be chairing that Q&A as well as speaking to you about the work of the Centre for Ageing Better in a moment. But before we hear from the other What Works centres, a word of welcome from James Gore from Arup. So over to you, James.
Thank you, Anna, and good afternoon, and thank you for the opportunity to join you all today. Just by way of introduction, I'm James Gore. I'm from Copper Consultancy. We're actually part of the Arup-led Towns Fund Delivery Partner Consortium, and our role is to help towns with their funding bids, and hopefully the towns joining us today are familiar with the work we've been doing. In summary, we're here to offer advice, tools and access to learning, and in addition to that, we're keen to provide opportunities for towns to work with other organisations who may be able to add value. So that clearly includes the members of the What Works network who are joining us for the session today. So it's a great opportunity for me to learn from today's speakers about what they can offer towns and how towns can access that expertise. Before I make way for the first of the speakers today, I wanted to share a few thoughts on the session's subject matter, developing evidence-informed local plans. I think all of us would agree that evidence should be at the heart of a good town investment plan. But in my view, there's 2 aspects to this, and both of them are very important. The first is all of the data, the economic data, the socio-demographic evidence that goes to support your town investment plan and the projects that it proposes. Secondly, and equally important in my view, is the evidence of engagement, that buy-in from communities that's vital to the success of the projects that you're looking to get off the ground. And the latter is my focus as the delivery partner service lead on stakeholder engagement. And I point to the very high bar set in the guidance provided by MHCLG for towns. To me, it's very clear that this isn't a box ticking exercise. Evidence of engagement and a genuine commitment to continue the conversation with stakeholders is required as part of town investment plans. So to quote from the further guidance, which I'm sure you're all very familiar with, this is a key part of developing the town investment plan, and we want towns to demonstrate the buy-in they've secured with the community. The guidance goes on to say the level and quality of community engagement, what's been done so far, what's planned in the future, will be a key factor when assessing and agreeing the town deals. So it's clearly very important to evidence all the good work that you're doing. And we've seen some great examples of that already from towns in cohorts 1 and 2. We've seen some really creative use of town deal boards, whether that's through forming stakeholder groups, community panels, or other offshoots of the main town deal board. We've seen some fantastic use of existing stakeholder networks to reach out to communities, particularly those seldom heard groups that aren't always part of the conversation. And using the public estate to promote and provide information around consultation on different projects. And finally, some really innovative use of digital tools to adapt to the COVID world that we're all living in and the challenges that brings. And all of this good stuff shouldn't stop on submission of the town investment plan. I think it's clear from the further guidance that stakeholder engagement remains important through business case development and beyond into project delivery. Indeed, as does providing evidence across the board. So this is a very, very relevant topic for towns, whatever stage you're at, whether you're still working on your town investment plan, or whether you're starting to think about how to engage and how to build up your evidence case, developing business cases and through to project delivery. But with my stakeholder engagement hat on, I'm particularly interested to hear, I'm interested to hear from all of the speakers today, but I'm particularly interested in what Ageing Better have to say on the role of older consumers and citizens. Digital exclusion's been a hot topic, an area of concern for several towns that I've spoken to. So I'm keen to hear what Anna has to say on this subject. And I think it's going to be very useful for towns who are wrestling with some of those challenges. I think it's clear from the interactions I've had with towns that everyone feels passionate about building a legacy from the Towns Fund. And that's not just through the bricks and mortar, the buildings and infrastructure created as a result of the funding that the Towns Fund will hopefully secure for your towns, but it's also through the networks that are being built and hopefully maintained beyond the lifespan of the project, and the skills that local people are going to be empowered with for the future. I think digital is a great example here. I think the challenge for all of us is looking at whether we can design engagement tools that are accessible and intuitive as possible for those users who aren't as confident or willing to embrace digital technology. And at the same time, looking at how we can use some of those traditional communication and engagement methods in a fresh and engaging way to bring new audiences into the conversation. Because I think it's important that all members of the community have a voice, and their views need to form part of the evidence base that we're talking about today. Showing how this evidence has helped identify challenges, shape your vision, and prioritise the projects that form part of your town investment plans is really, really important. And I'm sure today's speakers are going to have some very, very helpful advice on how towns can achieve this. And I look forward to listening to that advice over the next 50 minutes or so. So I'm going to stop talking now, and I'll hand back to Anna to introduce your first speaker. Anna.
Thanks very much, James, and hopefully you'll join for discussion, because I'm sure it would be great for you to participate in that part of our session today. But without further ado, I'd like to introduce the first of our main speakers, Meg Kaufman, who is based at the Centre for Cities, and she will be speaking on behalf of the What Works Centre Local Economic Growth. Over to you, Meg.
Thanks, Anna. All right, fingers crossed for the Wi-Fi. It's going to be a good day. I know it's going to be a good day for the broadband. I have some slides. Does that look all right? So I'm Meg Kaufman. I'm the head of outreach for the What Works Center for Local Economic Growth, also known as What Works Growth. And we provide advice to local policymakers. Our goal is to try and improve the impact of local economic policy through the use of evidence. We are a partnership between the Centre for Cities and the London School of Economics. And we have, over the last 7 years, we've sort of reviewed all of the really good evidence evaluations that are out there. We've tried to collect them all together and organize them, and then give people advice on how to use the evidence. So I'm going to tell you a little bit about what kind of resources that we have, how we can help you in setting up your town's fund plans, how we can help, what kind of resources are available on our website, And then I'll talk a little bit about some of the key messages that I thought might be useful from our years of looking at the evidence. First of all, I'll talk about the objectives that we use. Obviously, what you measure is just as important as how you measure it. And the most important objectives that we use are wages and employment and productivity. And that really with the focus on the first two, wages and employment. There isn't a lot of evidence about the local economic effects on productivity of different policies. So we tend to focus on wages and employment. Now, there are lots of other objectives that local economic policy can measure and can hold out as a goal. Things like, business churn is a really popular one, or broadband provision and the number of people who get broadband, and congestion as well for transport projects. But we think that wages and employment are actually the most useful measures of how local people are faring. How they're faring in the local economy. So just because businesses are doing better doesn't necessarily mean that is making its way through to people's wages and to the employment levels in a local area. So those are the two objectives that I would say we focus on most. The other thing I wanted to say about our approach is our use of impact evaluation evidence. Partly because in the beginning we didn't have many people and we had to narrow down what we could look at. We always use impact evaluation as our standard for robustness of evidence. So we are not just interested in how many people went through an employment program and then got jobs. We're always going to want to see an evaluation that provides a comparator. So then the number of people who didn't go through the program who got a job anyway. If we're looking at something like business support and we got the number of businesses supported and how much better they did because of that support, we want to see what happened to businesses that didn't get supported. So we know that the effect isn't just something that was going on in the economy at the time. In many cases, this very rigorous approach to evidence means that we don't have a lot of evidence on some topics, which is really frustrating. But in those cases, we always try and provide guidance about how to think about those topics, how to think about those policies critically and about what their impact might be all the way through the policy process. So even when we don't have evidence, we always try and provide guidance. I usually recommend that people start on our website where we started, which was with our policy reviews. So we started working with a team of people at Arup, actually, looking at different policy areas and trying to find all of the good evaluations that we could from across all the OECD countries over the past 30 years that were in English language, and then try and glean some lessons from those evaluations. So we think we've covered every major economic development policy area. If you're going to run a broadband project or a sport and culture project, I always recommend that you start by looking at our policy review. It'll give you guidance on what to think about in terms of those projects and what you can expect from them. Where there is really good evidence, it'll tell you what the evidence says. But it will also provide you with kind of all of the underlying studies. So all the resources are there. If you're interested in a particular aspect of the policy, it'll provide the signposting that you need to go back and look at studies that were done on that policy. So it's a good place to start. Another resources that we have is our toolkits. We call them toolkits, but really they focus on specific aspects of policy implementation and how to maximize the impact of any particular aspect of policy implementation. So a good example here, one that I really liked was we did a couple toolkits on accelerators and incubators. And if you are going to try and set up an incubator in your town center, say, to support small businesses, one of the interesting findings when you look carefully at incubators and accelerators is businesses that are in an incubator are actually slightly more likely to fail than businesses that aren't in an incubator. And that is because the type of people who run these businesses, entrepreneurs, when they get into an incubator and they get really good support about their business and its prospects, they're actually likely to find out earlier if a business isn't going to be sustainable. The support enables them to see, to project better into the future, and they're more likely to close down their business a bit earlier than businesses that don't get the kind of incubator treatment. Now, knowing the kind of people who run the businesses that are in incubators, entrepreneurs, that's not necessarily a bad thing, because those people usually have 10 other projects, that they've got in their head boiling around. So an increased turnover in businesses that are in incubators might not necessarily be a bad thing for your local economy or for the people who run those businesses, but it's a counterintuitive finding. So our toolkits will provide guidance on aspects like that. If you want to set up a mentoring program, our toolkit will tell you a little bit about how to do it and how to get the best value for money from it, and how to make it as successful as it can be, and what you need to watch out for. We also have just been rolling out some toolkits on particular topics of interest related to the COVID recovery that might be of interest to you now for other reasons besides the town fund, looking at how to cope with major job losses and youth unemployment, which is always, such an important topic, as well as data resources. There's also a lot of resources on our website about how to evaluate, but I won't go into that into any detail today, but just if you're thinking about evaluating your town's fund projects and how to collect the data and how to find a control group, there's stuff there to help you start out on that. I wanted to talk quickly about just the key lessons that I think are important for places that are looking at towns fund kind of proposals, just from our experience of looking at the evidence all these years. First of all, is being really clear about your objectives. And the two examples I use here are sports and culture projects, but also cycling and walking projects, which are really popular projects and people love them. And they're really good for health, they're really good for well-being, and there are lots of great social benefits. There's not a lot of evidence, and believe me, we've tried, but there is not a lot of evidence that these kinds of projects have economic benefits, that sustainable economic benefits. And we found that very depressing when we first looked at the evidence around sport and culture and cycling and walking. But actually, the advice that I think people should have is not that you don't do, obviously you do these projects because they're important and they're good for people and they've got lots of other benefits, but I would recommend that you not spend a lot of time trying to make an economic case for a sports project or for a cycling project. Focus your effort on the other benefits of the project and make sure that you're looking for your economic benefits from the projects that are most likely to provide economic benefits. So I think that's just a useful message. So you aren't overloading your projects, trying to always have an economic case. The other reason is because sometimes making economic cases can be expensive and time consuming when you get into multipliers and that kind of forecasting. So I always recommend that you leave projects that aren't going to have big economic benefits to the side and focus instead on those where the economic benefit is the main objective of the project. The second key lesson is thinking critically about who's going to benefit. So when you do provide support to a business, that business might find that it might provide better turnover for them. It might make them more likely to survive a downturn, that sort of thing. But unless that translates into benefits for people who live in the area, we would say you need to keep that in mind. So if business support leads to increased employment by that business or increased wages for the people who work for that business, we would say that's a better output, a better objective than thinking about just the business surviving longer, because that may not necessarily impact the local economy very much. The second one is something that often comes up in economic development and economic evaluations, is just property prices. And obviously a lot of transport projects will have a really positive impact on property prices, as will public realm improvements. And that's fine, but you need to think again critically about property prices and who that benefits. That tends to benefit the landowners, and that may in fact have a negative benefit on people who find that their rents go up as a result of increasing property prices. So always good to be critical about using those kinds of objectives. And finally, it's just thinking about sustainability. So displacement is a really important issue for local projects. If you're building a brand new shopping center and a lot of retailers move in there, if they've left an empty shop around the corner, that's not such a great result really, and it doesn't bring a net benefit to the local economy. I mean, you could say the same thing for grade A office space. If you put in subsidized rent in grade A office space, you might find businesses moving into it, but they might leave empty premises behind, which is still a problem. And finally, longer term, when you provide incentives, for example, for rent subsidized to get businesses to move into a certain part of your area, or incentives to businesses to provide more apprenticeships, we often find that the benefits of those programs, they may work in the short term, but once the incentive ends, then the benefit ends. So it's always important to think about how you make those kinds of impacts sustainable, maybe after the program ends. Finally, just how we can help, we are happy to provide ad hoc advice. If you get in touch with me on my email address, I can point you to the person who can give you the best advice on your particular policy interest. We found special projects to be very useful, where we'll get together a group of places that are all working on the same type of policy, or the same issue, and getting them talking to each other over a short series of meetings with some expert input. I think it might be really useful to do that kind of approach for maybe some of the town's fun places. So if you're interested in getting involved in a project like that, they tend to be to provide a really good insight that you get from other places as opposed to just from us, more sitting on the sidelines. And finally, we can arrange free workshops on any policy evaluation or even on the evidence base around a particular policy area. We run those workshops free for your place. So please don't hesitate to get in touch. Here's my email address, and you can also contact us through the website. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Meg. That was really a great overview and some super insights already there from the evidence work that you've done, and clearly lots of resources for any town thinking about the economic impacts. We're going to move now to the social impacts, some of which you talked about, and being clear which projects are going to deliver which outcomes. And I'm really delighted to introduce Joanne Smithson from Works Wellbeing. So over to you, Joanne. And if you could just get yourself off mute, then we can all hear you. We can see your slides, Joanne.
I was doing so well, wasn't I? Oh, right. Hello. Hi, I'm Joanne Smithson. I'm the local government lead at the Works Centre for Wellbeing. We're the UK's national body for wellbeing evidence, policy and practice, and we're an independent collaborative. When I talk about wellbeing, what do I mean? So for us at the centre, wellbeing is how we're doing as individuals, as communities and as a nation, and how sustainable that is for the future. You might see that referred to as social value or social welfare. Another really key concept for us is about wellbeing inequality. And when we talk about that, we talk about the extent to which people's experiences of their life vary within a population or within a group. So I'm sure you'll have looked in your plans at health inequalities, but I'd really encourage you to think about wellbeing inequalities as well. The notion of what makes a good life isn't new. Right at the start of work on GDP and productivity, we saw discussions about the extent to which GDP could capture what was valuable for us, and some developing criticism of why actually we need to go beyond GDP. And Meg's point about going beyond productivity as a measure is one that we'd really support. And I'd say really that the purpose of all of our policy is around improving people's lives. So is the purpose of your town investment plan to improve people's lives? And if that is the case, then how do we know we're doing it? And with wellbeing, we need to ask people, because wellbeing is subjective. We need for people to perceive wellbeing very differently. And there are 4 questions that I would look to see in your level of need. So when you're assessing the level of need in your population, I would look to see the wellbeing need. And there are 4 questions that we would routinely use. For those of you who have colleagues in public health teams, you can find this data in the fingertips profiles just by looking for self-reported wellbeing. And there's also information on the ONS website as well. And those are the 4 questions that we would look for. How satisfied are you with your life? Overall, to what extent do you feel the things you do are worthwhile? How happy did you feel yesterday? And how anxious did you feel yesterday? Those 4 elements for us cover wellbeing. And there's a couple of publications there that you can find on our website, on the Works Centre for Wellbeing website, looking at data around wellbeing need and wellbeing inequalities as well. And for those of you who are interested in COVID, you can see that I've put a little link. We have an email series looking at the wellbeing impacts of COVID that you can sign up for as well on our website. So the drivers of wellbeing, what makes a difference? So we know there are things on the right-hand side that are very strongly associated with positive wellbeing. So they're protective of our wellbeing. And that is our health, our physical health and our mental health. It's about relationships, the second biggest driver of wellbeing. So how in your town investment plans are you going to ensure that we develop spaces and places that are great for building relationships? Having good jobs and good quality jobs are hugely important. And if we think about the risk factors for low wellbeing, we know loneliness and poor health are particularly important, as is unemployment. But there are other things as well, so air quality and noise pollution and having low quality work can hugely affect our well-being. So for individuals, it's about feeling good and functioning well. It's about feeling confident, satisfied, safe and supported. It's about having lives that have purpose and meaning. And importantly, it's different for different people. And when we think about community well-being, so how do we build a town investment plan that maximises community well-being? There are some other features we need to consider. So for community well-being, it's about people, place and power. Building communities that foster networks, places where people can thrive. And that point that James really highlighted in the introduction about voice and representation, a sense that people living in our towns, working and playing in our towns, have a sense of influence over the things that are important to them. And they're inclusive towns and spaces where nobody feels excluded. One key point here is that our well-being isn't constant across our life course. The one Daily Mail headline I will quote is, "It's not great being 48, and that's because it's the lowest point of our life satisfaction. A lot of our work in health particularly focuses on an early start in life and aging well. And I would really encourage you, alongside those two vitally important groups, we think about working age. So really starting to think about how can our town investment plans benefit those people of working age, because they have the lowest well-being. So what works? So in terms of assessing the need, I've shown you how we can use the data collection there from fingertips. What I want to talk about now is the evidence of what works. So very similar to Meg, we have similar types of products. So we've done systematic reviews of spaces and places and found a range of approaches that can boost community infrastructure. And those are things and initiatives where we see people coming together. So the importance of spaces in like squares and town centres where people can come together. The idea of sort of bumping places where people can build relationships and can meet, hugely important. And actually the services that facilitate access to places. So one of the key areas in the Towns Fund is around transport and networks. And we'd really encourage towns to think about, yes, access to jobs and employment, but also access to places where we can use that community infrastructure, because we know that's particularly important. A little bit on drivers of workplace wellbeing. Our job is the third biggest driver of individual well-being, the top ones being our health, physical and mental health, and the second one being our relationships. So we know there are some really important drivers of well-being. And you might want to think perhaps in your Towns Fund plan, how you could use job quality in that. So it could be about encouraging partners who are working with you, who are providing jobs, to look at measuring job quality, measuring the well-being of their workforce and reporting on that to really try and improve that. Some great work that's been done in the West Midlands on that. If people are interested, I can share some case studies. We also have a range of other products that highlight the evidence base. So where Meg was saying there isn't quite as much evidence around the economic impact of sport and culture, cycling and walking, I absolutely have that evidence, but from a wellbeing lens. So you can see we've got a range of products, from systematic reviews and tackling loneliness, to toolkits around measuring workplace wellbeing, and systematic work around community business, for example. So do have a look. We've got a range of information there, and you can't find what you're looking for, then come and have a chat. Two more things just before to finish. In terms of cost effectiveness, there are different ways of measuring cost effectiveness, and we would argue that a wellbeing lens can be incredibly beneficial for that. So there's information within the Green Book on carrying out a wellbeing evaluation, and there's also information on our website as well. And if there are towns that are interested in taking that wellbeing cost effectiveness lens, we'd be really keen to bring that group of towns together and to work with them to understand what that could look like. So we've looked at the need in our population. We've used evidence of what works to design our interventions. What we need to do now is measure, and we look at the measures of progress. And from a wellbeing perspective, it's really important that those measures of progress have objective and subjective measures. So what is the incidence of safety? What is the incidence of crime in a local area? And how do people feel about that? What are the wages, and do people feel those wages are a fair reflection of their work? Subjective and objective measures together. We would also encourage you to take that long-term view and look at future wellbeing, so that the argument around and the discussions around social capital and natural capital and different capitals can be really important there. And the opportunity to look at those sorts of synergistic benefits can be really helpful. And importantly, it's not just about looking at the average, it's about looking at the distribution of the impacts as well. So are your town investment plans going to reach and empower those who need it most? Some measures that you could perhaps look at in terms of how growth can benefit a range of people across the locality are shown in that report. That's quite nice, but there are lots of other examples that we can share and that we have on our website as well. So just to finish, I would argue then that wellbeing can be the ultimate goal of your town investment plan, because wellbeing is personal, subjective, but universally relevant. And it's a relevant and credible way to measure what matters to local people and connect that with your town's fund goals. And to ensure that your town investment plan maximises wellbeing, we'd encourage you to have wellbeing in your goals and principles, and to have a wellbeing lens and appraisal and cost effectiveness, and wellbeing measures when you're monitoring and evaluating your impact. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Joanne, for that really clear presentation on wellbeing impacts. I'm going to now move us on to think about that in relation to the population that will be not only in your towns, living in them, working in them, playing in them, shopping in them, but also the future. And when we think and talk about ageing at the Centre for Ageing Better, we're not just thinking about older people today, we are thinking about the massive demographic shift that is happening in our population. And so this is really about encouraging you to future-proof your plans as you think about that. So I've got also a few slides to share, and I'm going to try and be disciplined myself on the time. So I guess the first thing to do is just make sure you understand that huge shift that is going on in the population. Many of us simply haven't really woken up to this changing reality. It's a bit like climate change, 20 years ago. We knew it was coming, but in some ways we did not do enough about it. And so we face a climate emergency today. In the same way, this age shift is happening, but we perhaps haven't woken up to it. And there are two main reasons for this change in the population. The first is that we're living longer than our parents and grandparents, a lot longer. So this shows that a baby born in 1916 could expect to live to about 58, somewhere down the left-hand side of the figure, whereas a baby born in 2016 can expect to see his 90th birthday. So a very dramatic shift. But it's not only that trend, it's the fact that there are going to be many more people reaching later life than at any time in the past. So we've had sort of two peaks in terms of baby booms after each of the world wars, but the longest baby boom, and coinciding with this longevity as well, is the 1960s baby boom. So between 1960 and 69, there were over 8.3 million births in the UK. And you can do the maths. These people are sort of turning 60 now. And so this is what it looks like when we look at that in terms of the age shift. So this is 20 years ago, 2000. You can see that there were, well, I can tell you there were 9.3 million people over 65. And the bar in black is, if you watch that, is that baby boomer 1960 generation. So today, they are in their 50s. And at the moment, there are over 12 million people over 65. And you can see this so-called population pyramid turning into a population rectangle as we fast forward 20 years, when we can expect there to be over 17 million people over 65. And it's not going to be until around 2050 that 1960s baby boom cohort in effect dies off, it goes off the top of this pyramid. So what does that mean for local areas? And I really encourage you to make sure that as part of your evidence to support you'll actually look at not only the sort of population profile today, but what that's projected to be in 20 years' time. And this little picture shows that, as you might expect, the places that have the larger proportion today of over 65 years, sort of a few dark patches, becomes the norm everywhere in the future. So, things that we might recognise in Torbay or particular areas of the country today are going to be the reality in most parts of the country in the future. So what can we do to help you at the Centre for Ageing Better? Well, we have a very positive mission to create a society using that evidence so that more people can enjoy later life. And we focus on 4 things that we think are going to make the most difference. And I think these are all relevant to your town investment plans, as I will show. Firstly, employment. How can we help more people to stay in fulfilling work? Housing, ensuring that there is a diversity of safe and accessible homes for people to live in as they age, to enable people to be as healthy as possible. No point living longer if most of that time we spend in poor health or with disability. And finally, very much in line with what Joanne was saying, creating communities where those social connections can flourish. So I'll just take each of those very briefly in turn. And in each of these, we, as with the other What Works centres, try and synthesize the evidence about what's known and share that, so that information is on our website. We also try and work with areas and local places and indeed with partners to evaluate and generate evidence through things like evaluation. So when it comes to our homes, at the present time, we know that most people want to live in their own homes. There's a lot of talk about building more specialist housing, but actually for most of our later lives, for most of those years beyond 65, we are going to be living in general purpose mainstream housing. So it's really critical that more of it is accessible. And at the moment, only 7% of houses even meet the most basic accessibility standards. And so there's a real opportunity, whether it's building new homes or through converting and under permitted development, retail or other office space into residential, that it meets higher accessibility standards. And we're working with others to campaign that the mandatory accessibility standards are increased. So we would really encourage through these town plans to really make sure that not only do developers, but also those that are being converted meet those higher level accessibility standards. That's going to make a huge difference both to the quality of life for people, but also it provides opportunities for people to move and right size that are not there in the market at the moment. So we see the lowest levels of house moves among people in that sort of 60s and 70s. And what happens is people hang on in their homes, even though they're not suitable, and end up in a crisis where they then have to make a crisis move either into specialist housing or a care home. Whereas if they had had a more accessible and adaptable home and moved earlier, they could have stayed in there for longer. So thinking about your housing, we would love to talk to you about that. In terms of creating better communities where people of all ages can connect, we've heard a little bit about the importance of community infrastructure, and we're looking at evaluating some of the community infrastructure that exists in Leeds through the neighbourhood networks. But we're also doing a community transport project in Leeds, having done some co-design work there to really rethink about the transport system and how it can enable people of all ages and abilities to stay active. And I would stress the importance that we place in our work, not only on evidence from research, but evidence from people with lived experience. So that idea that James put forward at the beginning of the importance of co-production and co-design, I would really stress. And one of the ways that you could do that is by connecting with age-friendly communities. There are over 40 local authorities who are now committed to being age-friendly communities. So if you don't already know whether your area is an age-friendly community, please contact us, look at the UK network of age-friendly communities and find out, and we can put you in touch. They are very well connected to older residents and can help you with that stakeholder engagement and community engagement that James talked about at the beginning. The third area is thinking about how you can promote healthier aging, and in particular, thinking about physical activity. We know that people are not meeting the physical activity guidelines, and that this drops off as people get older. So in thinking about how your towns promote physical activity, if you are thinking about active travel, thinking about how that can help people who are inactive in later life get active, the importance of your green and blue spaces, and there's good evidence about the health benefits of that. And again, this sort of urban design, thinking about making places walkable for all ages and abilities. And again, we have experience of that with age-friendly communities. And the final area I'd just like to touch on before I finish is employment and economy. So consumers over 50 account for half of all household consumer spending, and it's a market that's worth £319 billion a year. And yet marketing reproduces some very negative stereotypes, anti-aging products and unrealistic images of people. A lot of the products are ugly and not really very attractive. So we've been working with the Industrial Strategy Challenge Fund and a lot of innovators and businesses to try and think about creative and inclusive products. So in thinking about sort of areas for economic growth in your area, supporting SMEs, thinking about this as a market for the future. But also thinking about, as was said, about good quality work opportunities, not only for people of sort of younger working age, but also older working ages. We see a real drop-off in people in employment at ages 55 and onwards, so that by the time people reach state pension age, about half are in work the year before then. And so if these people are not in work, they're not going to be contributing actively to the economy. So we've produced lots of evidence which local economic partnerships, local chambers of commerce, thinking about how do they create employment opportunities for older workers is really critical. And we have practical guidance coming out on that, on both flexibility and on hiring age positively. So I hope that that's given you a quick overview of some of the areas of evidence. But I suppose just really I'd like to stress this point about understanding not only your population today, but really future-proofing those town investment plans by understanding the age shift that's happening in the population and how you can support both your social outcomes, as spoken about by Joanne, and also your economic outcomes, spoken about by Meg, by also applying this ageing lens to your activity. And as with the others, we would be really happy to connect you with age-friendly communities, share advice, lots of it on our website. And if you are interested, and a group of Towns Fund are interested specifically in pursuing this, we may also be in a position to convene. So thank you very much. I'm going to stop sharing and invite the others to join me as we move from presentation into discussion and Q&A. So thank you. Great. So I am going to open up the Q&A and invite you to do the same, those of you who are with us live this afternoon, and really encourage you to post any specific questions that you might have for myself, for Joanne, for Meg, or for James. But perhaps whilst we're waiting for you to post your questions, we can perhaps just ask James, you've heard a little there from each of us. And I think at the beginning you posed me a question, which actually I didn't answer in my presentation, which was about sort of digital and post-COVID. So I wonder if we might sort of start actually with each of us just saying something about how do towns need to be responding, given the evidence that you have and have been looking at in terms of the particular impacts of COVID in terms of sort of influencing town investment plans. So I don't know, Joanne, if you would want to kick off with any sort of, in light of COVID, are there some specific things that you think have come up the agenda or you'd particularly expect to see featured?
Yeah, I suppose from a wellbeing perspective, the impacts on COVID have been very similar to the impacts we've seen on health. So where we've had existing inequalities, we've seen in many cases those have been exacerbated by COVID. So the top drivers of our well-being, so our health and our mental health, we've seen actually changes in the profile of people struggling with loneliness, for example. So we've seen more young people reporting loneliness, and we've also seen carers as well. So I would perhaps think about looking at how do our towns plans really look at those particular cohorts in terms of their well-being and activities and things we can do there. And I suppose the other area for us in terms of well-being is jobs. Absolutely, is the huge shifts in the workforce, the way that we're working. And for some, you know, they're able to adapt very well, and for others that has been incredibly challenging. So really just looking, I suppose, at understanding the well-being of your workforce and looking at ways to maximise that as well in your Towns Fund bid. Yeah.
Thanks, John. Meg, do you want to pick up this sort of question?
Yeah, I just wrote a blog on this, so this is great. I think one of the first things that we advise is to, as Joanne just said, think really carefully about how your people are being affected. Things like working from home, you know, they might have a big impact on some places. They might not have such a big impact on other places. And we find generally that the people who are able to work from home, again, are in the bracket of the more highly educated, highly skilled, high income people. So you need to think carefully about how this is impacting, you know, the people, or the most vulnerable people in your place. In terms of what you do with your Towns Fund, I think flexibility is going to be important. I mean, there's some very good studies that are saying that if we do come out of this 6 months to a year from now, things may really get back to pretty close to how they were before in terms of how the economy operates. So I would say, you know, don't panic, don't convert all of your space from, you know, one kind of use to another kind of use, because that's not always, first of all, it takes a long time to do that sort of thing. And it takes a long time to reverse that kind of thing if you've got it wrong. So I think flexibility is really important. And the third thing I would say, you know, this is maybe outside of the Town Fund parameter, but we know that young people are losing their jobs, or, you know, not getting jobs as they come out of school. It's the most vulnerable group right now in terms of this particular, what's happening this month, next month, and the month after that. You know, young people are having the worst impacts. So I would say think about that, you know, for now, and just keep monitoring the data and see what's happening in your town, see what's happening in your town center, and try and keep things as flexible as you can in terms of how you use space there.
So of course I would add, Meg, I guess, to put the other end of the workforce, because there is some evidence as well that similar to younger workers, the rates of furlough and redundancy are also impacting at the older end. And the additional thing is those with health conditions, which are obviously more prevalent. So there's more people having difficulties re-entering work because of their health status and whether they're being differentially treated. And the other, I guess, is that the evidence is that they're much less likely to get back into work. So they end up being sort of long-term, you know, they don't get back after redundancy at older ages. And so needing greater support and more targeted support, particularly from employers, to make sure that they have the right support to return. I guess, you know, we have seen a massive shift to digital, both in terms of digital services by default, and also a lot of social things. You know, the things that we used to go out and about to join in with, a lot of those have gone online. And we do have concerns because there is still an age gradient by, you know, far the largest number of people who've never been on the internet are at older ages, but there is also a socioeconomic gradient. And so this is not just a problem of older age. There are people in their 50s and 60s, depending on the jobs that they've had, have very limited use of, and particularly may only access certain types of social media. What they don't have are digital skills that are either work related digital skills, or that enable them to have digital confidence to do some of the things like online shopping, banking, and so on. And one of the great things about COVID is it's provided an impetus to do more to address the digital gap, and also has motivated perhaps some people who in the past didn't see why bother. So we know we can begin to close the digital gap. We've seen efforts to do that, but there's a long way to go. And some of that is about providing, universal access. So thinking about, the need to provide sort of free broadband, free Wi-Fi across a place to really reduce that sort of cost and access barrier. But also, how is it that we build in the sort of digital confidence and digital skills building to the moments when people need and want it? So, this is not about going off to a sort of doing a digital skills class, which I think has been sort of in the past. The work and evidence we've done with Good Things Foundation, and we can point to some of that, suggests it's about skilling up people, family members, but also other workers who can be hands-on, as it were, in supporting people to become digitally confident. So we're also putting something out particularly about how to do digital engagement. So I think that was your point about digital co-production. So this has come up in particular for the innovators and businesses that we're supporting as part of the Industrial Strategy Challenge Fund. And we'd be very happy to share with Towns Fund bids and boards that specific work about how to do digital co-production. So definitely agree with you, James, it's a big issue, and that's how we have looked at the evidence in terms of what needs to be done. But James, any sort of additional thoughts or questions that you'd like to pose to us as a group of What Works centres thinking about evidence and research and its importance for the towns?
Yeah, thank you. Thanks for those answers to the initial question I posed, which were really helpful. And I think you're absolutely right. The word you used was impetus, I think, wasn't it? And it definitely feels like an opportunity, albeit a challenging one, but definitely an opportunity given the way everyone's being pushed to, whether it's getting a GP appointment or ordering groceries, to do everything online. It feels like it's an opportunity to make that easier and to equip people with the right skills that could benefit everyone. In terms of a question to you all, now that I've got all of you experts on hand, I think the question I'd ask is around how towns might address challenges to data, which is drawn from kind of past experience and performance. And the example I'd use would be around retail footfall. So if a town has developed projects that in part has been based around evidence from a pre-COVID world, how might they go about quickly establishing or sense checking or testing that data to establish whether their proposals are still fit for purpose, as it were?
Great question. Do you want to take that first, Meg, and then perhaps Joanne from a wellbeing perspective?
Yeah, it's a big question. Obviously, I think we are doing some work right now and how to think about recovery and what kind of data you use and how you baseline, because it's hard to know whether you should be, what your expectations should be. Should you be comparing against how things were last year, or should you be comparing against how things were in March, or should you be comparing against how things were in August? So that's something that we've all been struggling with, and we want to do some more work on that. The Center for Cities has a really good recovery tracker that is looking at footfall, and we know that footfall is recovering better in sort of towns than it is in bigger cities, where people aren't going into the cities to work as much, and therefore footfall has been a real problem there. The data is always challenging, and I know a lot of the footfall data can be very expensive, but as I said, there are some resources, particularly Center for Cities has good resources on that.
Great. Joanne?
Yeah, so I suppose the data for me around wellbeing is how are people doing, and how do we get a bit of a snapshot around that to ensure that our plans are really responding to what people are feeling now. I know our colleagues at the Centre for Thriving Places have some tools and things that people can use to get a bit of a pulse check as to how people in their local area are doing. So that might be one way we could do that. I think the other point that I'd like to flag on unemployment is just the huge impact that has on people's well-being, and the long tail that has as well, particularly for young people in employment as well, and for older people and their links with health. So really just to be aware of that and to explore that. And some of the things that we know make a difference are around learning as well. So we know that learning as adults and learning in the workplace is incredibly well-being enhancing. So perhaps looking at how in some of those packages of support that we can design, how can we look at building those elements into that as well? So, yeah.
And I would just add, I suppose, that there is a challenge sometimes in bringing together local data that can really build a full picture. So obviously, you know, the first thing is just population data on who and what you expect those population shifts to be. Obviously, we are maybe going to see some unexpected direction. You know, there's lots of predictions about people if they're no longer tied to the office, will they be moving to more rural areas? So we may see some discontinuity in that, but, you know, I think running some scenarios and at least understanding how the population profile is going to change over the next period. You know, there is data on health, often not linked to other data, but trying to understand, you know, what are the big health issues in your area? You know, how active are people? And again, you know, there are sources we can point people to. And again, housing, you know, have you got a good housing conditions survey? What is your understanding of the current stock of housing and how suitable and accessible it is? And again, you know, we've been looking at data on house moves, you know, who is moving, who isn't moving, what sort of thing are they moving to? So I think it's really about taking different data, administrative data that is already available, building up that sort of picture, but then, yes, challenging and saying what might be different in light of COVID, because, you know, there will be some discontinuities, and at least doing some sort of scenario. But I think all of us would be saying, if you want help to think about what data you might specifically and additionally want to collect as baseline data and as part of your ongoing evaluation of both the social and economic impacts on all ages, then we really, you know, we do have lots of experience, both about the sort of measures that are well validated and also about evaluation design. So I think that's an open invitation from all of us. And I'm very conscious that we've actually already run out of time. So I think unless there are any sort of pressing questions, I think I will move to just thank everybody, and particularly to James for joining us this morning, and from Meg and Joanne, sorry, this afternoon, whenever you're watching. Thank you to those of you who've joined live. We will be making this available through the Towns Fund website. We will also make PDFs of the slides available. And as we've all indicated, each of our websites is rich with information, but please do also email us individually, and our contact details will be made available if you would like to follow up on any of the specific things that we've talked about today. As a group of What Works centres, we're really keen that the evidence that we already have, the things that we already know, are shared, and so that they can inform what you do. So please do get in touch with us if you think we can be of help. But we're also really keen to make sure we learn from new initiatives, and there are lots of gaps in what we know. And so we would really like you to commit to work with us to help build the evidence base by collecting data and evaluating things that we could learn with and from you as you develop your business cases and then move towards agreeing your town investment plans. So thanks very much, everyone. Thanks to Meg and Joanne and to Paul for helping organise this behind the scenes. And we look forward to continuing to engage with you and to seeing which towns are moving forward with plans. And we look forward to engaging with you. So thanks very much.
Thanks, Anna. Thank you.